All right, so this week we look at Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes continues the tradition of human nature. He gives us a different definition than some of the other theorists and thinkers and stories that we've experienced thus far. And he's renowned. I mean, his view of human nature is one of the most prominent, one of the most recognizable to have existed. And his solution is equally prominent and both praised as well as completely trashed and rejected. So, who is he? So Thomas Hobbes, he's an English philosopher. He wrote in the 1600s mainly, and his masterpiece was the Leviathan. So when you think of Thomas Hobbes, that is what most people would think of, and the political theory that is associated with it. Now, he wrote in France, this masterpiece, because he had fled from England, and he had fled because there was a civil war going on, and this civil war deeply impacted not only his own personal life, but his view of the world. Now, he is a social contract theorist, which means that he believes that human beings and human society comes into existence from a sort of agreement. Maybe not explicit, maybe not completely conscious, but some sort of agreement by human beings to leave the natural conditions, the original state that they're in, and form a society. And so, like all other social contract theorists, he begins with a state of nature. He's going to talk about what humanity was like in its original condition, before society, before institutions, before laws, before political mechanisms and apparatuses and things like that, before police, before enforcement, before a business. So all social contracts theorists will do this. They'll talk about the state of nature. And what Hobbes is renowned for is his extremely pessimistic view of the natural state. So he did not believe that human beings in the natural state were good, or that the life was peaceful, or that life was good, or fulfilling, or joyful, like some other social contract theorists have. He had a very dark, negative picture of what human beings were like in this original condition. And the original condition for Hobbes is that we're in a state of war. So he believes we're in a state of conflict. That is, if left to ourselves, what would occur. We would fight with each other, we would steal from each other, we would rape each other, we would kill each other. And so why is this? Well, his argument is essentially that human beings seek to fulfill their desires. And they're going to call good that which they desire, and they're going to call bad that which they seek to avoid, that which they do not desire. And human beings are going to do this, and they're going to find good in this way. And we're going to pursue our desires. We're going to seek to attain what it is that we want. And we're going to seek to avoid what it is that we don't want. And the other element of this is that human beings are going to define good and bad differently. Some may define it by material wealth. Some may define it by the spouse that they have. Some may define it by their intellect. Some may define it by their passion. Some may define it by tranquility or peace and philosophy or meditation. So everybody can define the good in different ways. And these goods, because they're defined in different ways, and because we are going to pursue our good as we define it, we're naturally going to come into conflict with one another. We're naturally going to want what other people want, or what other people want is going to diminish what it is that we want. And so this constant kind of conflict, and that's where we exist. And this is our natural conditions. And it doesn't only, and this is important, it doesn't only pertain to the situation in which we're actually fighting with one another, we're actually stealing from one another, we're actually, trying to dominate one another. It's also the state in which we fear one another, the state of anxiety, the state of tension, the state of insecurity. The threat that there may be physical violence is itself also natural. And the fact that physical violence could occur at any time is part of that anxiety. And he famously, one of his, quite arguably, his most famous line of philosophy ever written, one of the most famous lines of philosophy ever written, he says, life in the natural condition is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So it's solitary because we can't trust anybody else. We're isolated. Everyone is an enemy or potential enemy. There's no true human communion, no true human relationships, and so it's very much about isolation. It's poor because we cannot not only build up material wealth, and we can't do that at an individual level or a social level because there is conflict, tension, constant turmoil. There's not the stability that you need to build up wealth at a material level, but it's also poor in the sense that there's no culture. When you're fighting for your survival every day, you can't compose an opera, you can't write a great speech, you can't work on a master novel. You're literally just fighting to survive. You're literally trying to make it to the next day. And so all that society gives us, all the richness that it gives us, and the spiritual richness too, I mean, think of religion, would be lost. It is nasty and brutish, not only because of the threat of violence, but again, we're struggling every day to survive. We are getting the bare necessities. We are worried about others. There's nothing that is elevating us. And so this conflict, this turmoil, this tension, it is brutish. And then finally, it's short because of all these factors. You're not going to live very long in a society where your enemies are ever present, where something can be taken from you at every moment, where you're going to be fighting, or the threat of fighting is constant. And so that's his condition. That's why it's very dark, and that's why it's very pessimistic. And so what evidence does he give? Well, he says, look, in the English Civil War, he saw this. So for him, civil war isn't an abnormality. It isn't a degradation of our natural condition. It's not a loss of our natural condition. It is the exemplification, the example of what we are in nature. But he also says, just examine how we approach reality, how we go about our daily lives. We will lock our car doors. We will lock our house. We won't leave that open. We will be suspicious of others. Oftentimes, I'll talk to people, and especially girls, and they'll say, well, I'm not going to go run on that trail at night because I don't know who's out there. There's this sense that there's this threat that is ever present, that you could always be in trouble, and you got to think about how you would get out of it. And so we've got this natural state. It's very dark. It's very filled with violence and tension. And our basic desire is to survive. That's what we most want. And so what is the solution? Well, the solution for Hobbes is a contract. We essentially get together as society, and sometimes explicitly, sometimes not, and we agree that there's going to be certain rules that govern us and certain rewards and punishments, particularly punishments, if we break those rules. And so we're all kind of buying in. We're all saying, here's what we're going to agree to do. We're all going to give up our freedom or part of our freedom so that we can have stability, we can have security. And that is the most basic political good and value that we can get, because that allows for survival. But then, another question arises, well, who makes the rules that we're going to follow? Is it just everybody in society? He would say no. I mean, a democratic solution is going to be inadequate for Hobbes. And the reason is because every different group will try to make the rules in a way that benefits them. And inevitably, the different groups will come into conflict with one another, and there will be tension, there will be disorder, there will be a breakdown of unity, and we will come back eventually to a lack of stability and security and that natural condition. Just think about whether that's true in our modern day democracy. Certainly we live in a very tumultuous political time where people passionately disagree about what values we should adopt and the mechanisms to fulfill those values. Should we value security more than we value tolerance or open borders or immigration? Should we value the government having more power or the people having more power? Should we allow people to have fewer taxes, lower taxes? Or should we tax certain groups of people more? These are all values and conflicts that there's real disagreement about. And you'll see sometimes a real tension, like states threaten. Now, who knows if it's really serious, but maybe we'll get to the point where it's really serious. During President Obama's term, Texas threatened to secede, at least some in Texas, not officially or anything like that. And now with President Trump, California, at least some in California, have threatened to secede. So there is a sense where, look, things can break down. And historically, things have broken down. This is not just purely academic or purely theoretical. We have undergone a civil war in our country. And it is not necessary that that never happens again. It could happen again. Okay. So you've got this situation, and he's not going to appeal to democracy. He doesn't think that's a very good solution to this turmoil and this natural conflict. His solution is to give all power to a single ruler. He thinks that's the only way out. And he says, look, if we give this power to a single ruler, what he calls a Leviathan, hence the title of the book, that is going to be the best route to producing security and stability. And he says, look, you're going to lose some freedom, but the loss of freedom associated with this ruler is much better. It is a small price to pay for the alternative, and the alternative is chaos, a poor, nasty, brutish, short life, a life where you are in constant jeopardy of losing your own existence or your possessions, a life where you're in constant jeopardy of becoming dominated. Remember, even if you are at the top of the pile, even if you're the strongest or you're the smartest, there's always that threat that somebody could overtake you. There's always that threat that somebody stronger or smarter or more powerful comes around. Okay, so he says, look, that's what we got to do. We've got to accept the loss of this freedom, the loss of the ability to make our own rules, in exchange for security and peace. And if security and peace are the fundamental, the most basic values, that makes sense as to why he would pursue those values. Now he also says, look, for those that would think this is a grave injustice, that this is a violation of fundamental rights, that this is something that should never be allowed to occur, even if there are certain benefits, Hobbes essentially says, look, notions of right versus wrong, good versus bad, they come about from society. In the state of nature, there is no universal right or wrong or good and bad. There's just individual opinions. And so the only way that we get values is through a stable society. Otherwise, the only value is the idea of might makes right. That person who is in power is going to tell you what to do, and that's going to define what rights you have, what your duties are, what your obligations are. So we either got might makes right, or we got the ability to agree to a single power that is going to define justice, is going to define laws and things like that. Now, at this point, many people say, give me the state of nature. That is better than the alternative. That is better than a single ruler. I'd rather be free and anxious and live in this turmoil as opposed to a slave obeying the single ruler. And Hobbes says, well, look, it may seem like the sovereign can do whatever he or she wishes, and in a certain sense he or she can, but there are certain reasons to say, well, wait a minute, perhaps there are certain reasons the sovereign may not rule in a purely arbitrary or idiosyncratic or malicious manner. And why is that the case? Well, there's a couple reasons. There's three reasons. Before I get to them, there's one final point I want to make about the sovereign. Hobbes would say, even if we have a bad sovereign, even if the Leviathan isn't the best or is cruel or is unjust, it is still better than a state of chaos, a state of nature. A bad sovereign is better than no sovereign. And remember, you can't really challenge the sovereign as being unjust or being cruel or being mean or being bad, in the sense that there is no universal standard of justice to which you could appeal to make your judgment. The values and the moral notions that we adopt and we adhere to only come about in society. The other element here is that essentially we'd only call a sovereign good or bad based upon whether it is good or bad for us. Just like the state of nature, we would define good or bad in purely individual or personal terms. And Hobbes says if you reintroduce that as a basis to deny the sovereign or challenge the sovereign, you've essentially reintroduced the conditions for civil war and for the state of nature. And those conditions are most profoundly based upon the notion that each individual defines right versus wrong. Now, to get back to this idea that it seems like the sovereign can do whatever he or she wishes and can rule in whatever manner he or she wishes. Well, there's three reasons to think that that might not be the case, that the sovereign might not be as arbitrary as he or she first appears. Well, one reason is a popular image that Hobbes often gives of the sovereign and the Leviathan, and that image is, and you can kind of look it up on Google, is defined by the head of the sovereign, the head of the Leviathan being the individual, the ruler, but the body is made up of the populace, of the individuals. And so with this image of the body, the prince is the head, is in control. But all the citizens make up the body, and if you follow this metaphor and you adopt it, then essentially harming individual citizens or harming groups of citizens for no reason, in a way that doesn't help the good of the whole, would essentially be akin to harming yourself, cutting off your hand for no reason. Not because it's disease, not because it's acting out against you, but simply because you want to. And you want to punish it just for purely idiosyncratic and personal and arbitrary reasons. And that doesn't make sense. So if you buy the fact that the sovereign is part of the body, the head of the body, then there's a reason why he or she would not simply rule in an arbitrary way. Another reason to guard against arbitrary rule, and this is very counterintuitive at first, is that the sovereign is completely superior to any individual or any groups within society. There are no checks and balances. We often talk in the United States about checks and balances, that the president can't do whatever he or she wishes because there is the court and there are the legislators that have power. They have to limit one another. Now with Hobbes, there is none of this. The sovereign's word goes. What the sovereign says is the law. It is, you might say, akin to kind of a Russian strongman, Vladimir Putin or something like that. And again, that seems like that just introduces the conditions for arbitrary rule and for chaos and for cruelty. But Hobbes also says, look, because of that superiority, the sovereign does not have to be subject, does not have to be cater to special interests. It's not like in contemporary politics, where a politician has to cater, promise certain things to a certain group, and avoid promising things to other groups, and give special favors and permissions to one group because that group helps him or her into power. The Hobbesian sovereign doesn't have to worry about that because he or she is so far superior and above. And so he or she can rule for the good of the whole without fear of retribution by an individual, group, or person. Now, as a third and final point, it's important to remember that for Hobbes, he's a social contract theorist. And that means that the sovereign's power is based upon the contract that brought that sovereign, that ruler, into being. And while the contract that brings this ruler into being gives the sovereign almost unlimited power, there is one check. The citizens and the people of pre-society humanity come into society and give power to a sovereign because they want security, they want stability. So if a sovereign is unable to produce that kind of security and that kind of stability, well, then we have a problem. Then we have essentially the sovereign rejecting the sole reason for which he or she was put into power, removing the basis, the foundation for why he or she is granted power. So if there is any reason, if there's any kind of legitimate way to critique, even overthrow the sovereign, it would be in that state in which the sovereign doesn't give the society what the society contracted the sovereign to give them, and that is security and peace. If the sovereign isn't doing that, isn't producing that, then that is a legitimate reason to go back to war and try to attain a new sovereign for that purpose. Okay, now if we move to the final kind of point here, that is the idea of natural law. The sovereign is supposed to rule and govern by natural law. Natural law, we won't go into a big discussion about it, but comes from the idea that God gives laws. Now the tweak here, the Hobbesian nuance, is that only the sovereign is the legitimate interpreter of divine law. Because if everybody could do it, if everybody can be interpreter of it, well then we'd be back into the state of nature where everybody defines good and bad as they wish, and everybody's going to define God's will as he or she wishes. So in terms of what God wants, in terms of God's law, that is up to the sovereign to determine. And again, it seems like, well, here we've got a purely arbitrary basis for power. The sovereign can interpret God's will in whatever way he or she wishes. Hobbes' response to this is essentially to say, well, there is immortality, and while the sovereign and the Leviathan may be all-powerful on earth, he or she will have to answer to God one day. And so, if the sovereign thinks, I'm just going to make up God's laws and I'm just going to define them in whatever way is beneficial to me, Hobbes says, well, he or she has to have in the back of his mind, his or her mind, that he or she will answer to God. And if they do this, if they abuse that power, that could result in a very poor eternal outcome. And that's a reason the sovereign could refrain from doing whatever he or she wishes. All right. So, with that in mind, that is Hobbes. A very dark picture of human nature. A picture of human nature of where we're in conflict, we're in toil, we're egotistic, we're selfish. We're not naturally communal. We're not naturally bound to relationships. But in that terrible, awful state, we want out, we want something better. And so we agree to give up our individual freedom, quite a bit of it, almost all of it, to the sovereign, in order for security and peace to prevail. All right, and that is kind of a Cliff Notes version of Hobbes, and I look forward to the discussions.